A luxurious yacht glides through the English Channel, its opulent decks hiding a deadly secret. Sir Reginald Hawthorne, a titan of industry, is found dead in his locked cabin, a revolver at his side, a scream echoing at 9:47 p.m. Was it suicide or murder? Hercule Poirot, the brilliant Belgian detective, steps aboard, his little gray cells unraveling a web of lies, deaths, and betrayals. Who screamed and why? What does the missing cigarette conceal? And who among the elegant guests, his grieving widow, his shaken daughter, or the ambitious fiancé, hides a killer's heart? Step aboard the sapphire yacht, where every clue counts, and the truth is as treacherous as the sea.
Chapter 1. The Setup. The sapphire yacht, a gleaming vessel of opulent design, cut through the glassy waters of the English Channel with the grace of a swan. It was the summer of 1928, and the sun hung low, casting a golden sheen across the deck where a select group of passengers had gathered for what was promised to be an unforgettable voyage. The yacht, owned by the wealthy industrialist Sir Reginald Hawthorne, was not merely a means of transport, but a floating palace, its polished wood and brass fittings gleaming under the attentive care of a discreet crew. This was no ordinary cruise. It was an exclusive gathering of Sir Reginald's inner circle, a celebration of his recent business triumphs in the textile trade. Yet beneath the polished surface of civility, a current of unease rippled through the air, as though the sea itself whispered secrets. Captain Arthur Hastings, ever the loyal companion of Hercule Poirot, stood at the starboard rail, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The sea breeze ruffled his neatly combed hair, and he adjusted his tie with a touch of self-consciousness. Hastings had been invited to this voyage at Poirot's insistence, though the detective himself had yet to make an appearance. Sir Reginald, it seemed, had requested Poirot's presence for reasons not entirely clear. Something about ensuring the harmony of the gathering, as the invitation had cryptically stated. Hastings, ever susceptible to the charm of luxury, had been delighted at the prospect of a week aboard the sapphire yacht. But now, as he observed the other guests, he felt a prickle of unease. The passengers were a curious assembly, each a distinct thread in the tapestry of Sir Reginald's life. There was Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, Sir Reginald's wife, a statuesque woman of 40, with an air of regal detachment. Her emerald necklace caught the light as she sipped champagne, her eyes darting occasionally to her husband with an expression Hastings could not quite decipher, affection perhaps, or something colder. Beside her stood their daughter, Miss Clara Hawthorne, barely 20, whose bright laughter seemed to mask a nervous energy. She clung to the arm of her fiancé, Mr. Lawrence Vale, a handsome young man with a quick smile and a reputation as a rising star in the financial world. His easy charm, however, did little to dispel the faint tension in his posture, as though he were perpetually on guard. Across the deck, Dr. Edmund Carver conversed with Mrs. Florence Marwood, a widow whose late husband had been Sir Reginald's business partner. Dr. Carver's scholarly demeanor contrasted sharply with Mrs. Marwood's flamboyant gestures, her crimson shawl fluttering as she recounted some anecdote with theatrical flair. Nearby, Mr. Gerald Trent, Sir Reginald's solicitor, leaned against the railing, his sharp eyes scanning the group with the precision of a hawk. He was a man of few words, but his presence carried an authority that suggested he knew more than he revealed. Finally, there was Miss Evelyn Grey, Sir Reginald's private secretary, a quiet woman in her 30s, whose plain attire and reserved manner made her easy to overlook, yet Hastings noticed how her gaze lingered on Sir Reginald, a flicker of something unreadable in her eyes. The dinner gong sounded, its rich tone echoing across the deck, and the guests began to move toward the dining saloon. Hastings followed, his thoughts drifting to Poirot. Where was the little Belgian? It was unlike him to miss an opportunity to observe human nature in such a confined setting. As Hastings entered the saloon, he was struck by its grandeur. A long mahogany table set with crystal and silver, chandeliers casting a warm glow, and a panoramic view of the sea through wide windows. Sir Reginald stood at the head of the table, his broad shoulders and commanding presence dominating the room. His voice, deep and resonant, carried a note of forced joviality as he welcomed his guests. "My friends," he began, raising a glass, "we are here to celebrate not only my recent successes, but the bonds that tie us together. Let us toast to friendship, to loyalty, and to the future." The guests raised their glasses, but Hastings noted the strained smiles, the fleeting glances exchanged across the table. Something was amiss, though he could not yet name it. Dinner proceeded with the elegance befitting such a setting. The courses were exquisite: consommé, poached salmon, roast pheasant. But the conversation felt stilted, as though each guest were guarding their words. Lady Beatrice spoke of her charity work with a practiced air, while Clara and Lawrence exchanged whispered remarks, their laughter a touch too loud. Dr. Carver discussed a recent medical conference in London, his tone measured, while Mrs. Marwood regaled the table with tales of her travels in Italy, her voice rising above the clink of cutlery. Mr. Gerald Trent remained largely silent, his fork poised thoughtfully, while Miss Evelyn Grey answered questions with quiet precision, her eyes rarely leaving her plate. As the dessert, a delicate lemon soufflé, was served, Sir Reginald rose once more, his face flushed with wine. "He has an announcement," he declared, his voice carrying a weight that silenced the room. "Tomorrow I shall reveal a decision that will affect us all. A change, shall we say, in the course of our shared endeavors." He paused, his eyes sweeping the table, and Hastings caught the flicker of alarm in Lady Beatrice's expression, the tightening of Lawrence Vale's jaw. But for now, Sir Reginald continued, "Let us enjoy the evening." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Hastings felt a chill, though the saloon was warm. What decision could Sir Reginald mean, and why did it seem to unsettle his guests so profoundly? As coffee was served, the conversation resumed, but it was now laced with a new tension, as though Sir Reginald's announcement had cracked the veneer of civility. After dinner, the guests dispersed to the deck or the lounge, and Hastings found himself alone, staring out at the dark sea. The yacht was anchored for the night, the stars bright above, but the beauty of the scene did little to ease his growing sense of foreboding. He glanced at his watch, 9:47 p.m. The evening was still young, yet something told him that this voyage would not end as peacefully as it had begun. As he turned to rejoin the others, a figure emerged from the shadows. Miss Evelyn Grey, her face pale in the moonlight. She said, "Captain Hastings," her voice trembling, "I must speak with you. It's about Sir Reginald. I fear something terrible is going to happen." Before Hastings could respond, a sharp cry pierced the night, echoing from the direction of the cabins. The sound was unmistakable, a scream of terror cut short. Hastings' heart raced as he exchanged a glance with Miss Grey, whose eyes widened in horror. Without a word, they hurried toward the source of the sound, the polished deck slick beneath their feet. The sapphire yacht, it seemed, was no longer a haven of luxury. Something dark had stirred, and Hastings knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that Hercule Poirot would soon be needed.
Chapter 2. The Crime. The scream still echoed in Captain Hastings' ears as he and Miss Evelyn Grey hurried down the narrow corridor of the sapphire yacht's lower deck. The polished wood panels gleamed under the soft glow of electric lamps, but the air felt heavy, charged with the ominous weight of that abrupt cry. Miss Grey's face was ashen, her hands clasped tightly before her, and Hastings, though accustomed to moments of crisis, felt his pulse quicken.
The corridor was silent now, save for the faint creak of the yacht's timbers and the distant hum of the sea beyond. They reached the source of the sound, a heavy oak door marked Owner's Suite. Hastings hesitated, his hand hovering over the brass handle. "Stay back, Miss Grey," he said, his voice low but firm. She nodded, her eyes wide, and took a step back, though her gaze remained fixed on the door. Hastings turned the handle and pushed, the door swinging inward with a faint groan. The scene that greeted him was one of opulent disarray. The suite was a masterpiece of design, with a four-poster bed draped in silk, a mahogany desk strewn with papers, and a crystal decanter glinting on a sideboard. But it was the figure slumped in the high-backed chair by the porthole that seized Hastings' attention. Sir Reginald Hawthorne, the larger-than-life host of this ill-fated voyage, sat motionless, his head tilted back at an unnatural angle. His eyes were open, staring blankly at the ceiling, and a thin trickle of blood ran from a wound at his temple, staining the white collar of his evening shirt. Hastings stepped forward, his military instincts taking over. He pressed 2 fingers to Sir Reginald's neck, searching for a pulse, but the skin was already cooling. "He's dead," Hastings murmured, more to himself than to Miss Grey, who had followed him into the room despite his caution. She let out a stifled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. "Dead?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "But how? Who could have done this?" Hastings' eyes scanned the room, noting every detail with the precision Poirot had so often urged him to cultivate. The porthole was closed, its latch secure. The desk was cluttered with documents, perhaps contracts or financial records, but nothing appeared obviously disturbed. A silver cigarette case lay open beside the decanter, a single cigarette missing. The clock on the mantel read 9:52 p.m., a mere 5 minutes since the scream had shattered the evening's calm. Most striking was the small pearl-handled revolver lying on the carpet near Sir Reginald's chair, its barrel gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Before Hastings could examine further, footsteps thudded in the corridor, and the other guests began to crowd the doorway. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne was the first to enter, her composure shattered as she saw her husband's body. "Reginald!" she cried, rushing forward, only to stop short, her hands trembling. "Oh, no! What has happened?" Dr. Edmund Carver pushed past her, his medical training evident in his swift assessment. He knelt beside the body, checking for signs of life, then shook his head gravely. "A gunshot wound to the temple," he said, his voice steady but grim. "Death was likely instantaneous." The others followed, their reactions a study in contrasts. Clara Hawthorne clung to Lawrence Vale, her arm muffled against his chest, while he stared at Sir Reginald's body with a strange intensity, his jaw tight. Mrs. Florence Marwood stood frozen, her crimson shawl slipping from her shoulders, her eyes darting between the body and the revolver. Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, surveyed the scene with a cool detachment, his sharp gaze lingering on the weapon. "This is a bad business," he muttered, almost to himself. Hastings stepped back, his mind racing. The scream had come at 9:47 p.m., and the clock now showed 9:54. The timing was critical, as Poirot would no doubt insist. "Did anyone see or hear anything unusual before the scream?" he asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Lady Beatrice shook her head, her face pale. "I was in the lounge, speaking with Florence, Mrs. Marwood. We heard nothing until that dreadful sound." "I was on deck," Lawrence Vale offered, his arm still around Clara. "We were together the whole time." Dr. Carver straightened, brushing his hands on his trousers. "I was in my cabin, reviewing some notes. I heard the scream and came at once." Mr. Trent's lips thinned. "I was in the smoking room, alone. The scream brought me here." Miss Grey, who had remained silent, spoke up, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was on deck, as I told you, Captain Hastings. I was about to speak with you when we heard it." Hastings noted their statements, though he knew better not to take them at face value. Poirot had taught him that alibis were often the first layer of deception. He glanced at the revolver again, its presence a glaring question mark. Had Sir Reginald taken his own life? The thought seemed absurd. His announcement at dinner had been bold, even defiant. Yet the room showed no signs of a struggle, and the porthole was locked from within. The yacht's captain, a weathered man named Captain Withers, appeared in the doorway, his face grim. "I've radioed for the authorities, but we're hours from shore, and the nearest police launch won't reach us until morning. I've ordered the crew to secure the deck and cabins." Hastings nodded, his mind already turning to his absent friend. "We need Poirot," he said aloud, drawing curious glances at the others. As if on cue, a small, impeccably dressed figure appeared in the doorway, his patent leather shoes gleaming, his mustache perfectly waxed despite the late hour. Hercule Poirot stepped into the room, his green eyes sharp and alert, taking in the scene with a single sweeping glance. "Mon ami Hastings," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a familiar note of authority. "It seems we have a tragedy on our hands. A tragedy, oui, but perhaps not an accident." The guests turned to him, some with relief, others with wary curiosity. Poirot's reputation preceded him, and his presence seemed to shift the atmosphere as though order might yet be restored to this chaotic scene. He approached Sir Reginald's body, his movements deliberate, his gaze lingering on the revolver, the cigarette case, and the scattered papers. "A gunshot, you say, Dr. Carver?" he asked, his tone deceptively mild. "Yes, a single shot, close range. The revolver was likely held inches from his head." Poirot nodded, his fingers brushing the edge of the desk. "And the time of death?" "Minutes ago," Dr. Carver said. "The body is still warm." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he turned to Hastings. "Mon ami, you heard the scream. At what precise moment?" 9:47, Hastings replied, grateful for his habit of checking his watch. "Bon," Poirot murmured. "And the rest of you? Where were you at this exact moment?" He addressed the group, his voice soft but commanding, his gaze moving from face to face. Their answers echoed the ones given to Hastings, though Poirot's scrutiny seemed to make each guest falter slightly. Lady Beatrice's hands trembled as she repeated her alibi, and Lawrence Vale's voice carried a defensive edge. Marwood's theatricality seemed subdued, and Trent's cool detachment wavered for a fraction of a second. Miss Grey, standing near Hastings, said nothing, her earlier warning ringing in his mind. "I fear something terrible is going to happen." Poirot knelt beside the revolver, careful not to touch it. "A curious thing, this weapon," he said, almost to himself, "so neatly placed, yet so inconveniently placed. And the cigarette case, why is one missing, I wonder?" He rose, dusting his hands, and turned to the group. "This room, mes amis, is a puzzle, and Hercule Poirot does not rest until the puzzle is solved." As the guests exchanged uneasy glances, Hastings felt a familiar thrill. The little gray cells were at work, and though the night was dark and the crime grim, Poirot's presence promised clarity. But the yacht was a closed world, its secrets locked within these walls, and Hastings knew the truth would not come easily.
Chapter 3. The Arrival. The air in the owner's suite of the Sapphire yacht was thick with tension, the oppressive silence broken only by the faint lapping of waves against the hull. Hercule Poirot stood at the center of the room, his small, immaculate figure a beacon of calm amidst the chaos of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's death. His green eyes, sharp as cut glass, moved methodically from the lifeless body to the revolver on the carpet, then to the faces of the gathered guests. Captain Hastings watched his friend with a mixture of admiration and anticipation, knowing that Poirot's mind was already weaving the threads of this tragedy into a tapestry of logic. The guests, still reeling from the shock, hovered near the doorway, their expressions a gallery of grief, fear, and suspicion. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne clutched a handkerchief, her knuckles white, while Clara Hawthorne leaned against Lawrence Vale, her eyes red from crying. Dr. Edmund Carver stood with clinical detachment, his hands clasped behind his back, and Mrs. Florence Marwood's usual flamboyance was subdued, her crimson shawl now draped loosely over her shoulders. Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, maintained his hawk-like vigilance, his gaze flickering between Poirot and the revolver. Miss Evelyn Grey, the quiet secretary, lingered at the edge of the group, her earlier warning to Hastings echoing in his mind. Poirot turned to Captain Withers, the yacht's commander, who stood rigidly by the door. "Monsieur le Capitaine," Poirot said, his voice precise and measured, "you have secured the vessel, oui? No one may leave or enter until the police arrive." "Yes, Mr. Poirot. The crew has been instructed to guard all access points. We're anchored for the night and no boats can approach without my knowledge." "Bon," Poirot replied, his mustache twitching slightly. "Then we have a closed circle, a petit monde, where the truth cannot hide for long." He clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace, his patent leather shoes silent on the thick carpet. "A murder has been committed, mes amis, and Hercule Poirot will uncover the one responsible. But first, we must establish order." He paused, his gaze settling on the revolver. "This weapon, it is most curious. It lies so conveniently near the body, yet its position suggests carelessness, or perhaps intention." He did not touch it, but gestured for Dr. Carver to approach. "Monsieur le Docteur, you have examined the wound. Is it consistent with a shot fired at close range?" Dr. Carver nodded, his tone professional. "Indeed, the powder burns around the temple indicate the muzzle was held no more than a few inches away. The angle suggests the shot came from the right side, consistent with a right-handed shooter, or perhaps Sir Reginald himself." Poirot's eyes narrowed. "Or perhaps, monsieur, someone who wished it to appear so." He turned to the group. "We must preserve this room exactly as it is until the police arrive. Captain Withers, please ensure no one enters without my permission." Withers gave a curt nod and stepped into the corridor, barking orders to a crew member. Poirot then addressed Hastings. "Mon ami, you were on deck when the scream was heard, oui? At precisely 9:47 p.m. "Yes," Hastings confirmed, glancing at Miss Grey, who stood silently nearby. "Miss Grey and I were speaking when we heard it. We reached the suite within minutes." Poirot's gaze softened as he looked at Miss Grey. "And you, mademoiselle, you were about to share a concern with Captain Hastings. Perhaps now is the time to speak." Miss Grey hesitated, her hands twisting together. I only meant to say that Sir Reginald seemed troubled this evening. He was not himself at dinner. I thought, perhaps foolishly, that something was wrong." "Foolish? No, mademoiselle," Poirot said gently. "The instincts, they are often the first to sense danger. Did Sir Reginald confide anything specific?" She shook her head. "No, but he was agitated when I delivered some papers to him this afternoon. He mentioned a decision that would change everything. I assumed it was about his business." Poirot's expression remained inscrutable, but Hastings knew that every word was being catalogued in his friend's meticulous mind. "Merci, mademoiselle. Your observation is noted." He turned to the others.
Now, mes amis, I must ask you to retire to the lounge. I will speak with each of you in turn. Captain Hastings, you will assist me, oui?" Hastings nodded, feeling a surge of purpose. The guests filed out, their footsteps heavy, and Poirot closed the door behind them, leaving only himself, Hastings, and the body of Sir Reginald. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier with the weight of death. Poirot moved to the desk, his gloved fingers hovering over the scattered papers. "These papers, Hastings, they may hold the key to our mystery. But first, let us consider the scene." He pointed to the revolver. "It is a Smith & Wesson, a model not uncommon, but its presence here is suggestive. Why leave it so prominently? And this cigarette case, open, with one cigarette missing. Did Sir Reginald smoke it, or was it taken?" Hastings frowned. "Could it be suicide, Poirot? The locked porthole, the revolver so close?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Suicide, mon ami, is a possibility, but it is not the only one. The mind of Hercule Poirot does not accept the obvious without scrutiny. The scream we heard, whose was it? And why did it stop so abruptly? These are questions that demand answers." He moved to the porthole, inspecting the latch. "Locked from within, as you say. Yet a locked room is not always what it seems." He turned to the chair where Sir Reginald sat, noting the angle of the body. The position of the head, the blood, it is all too neat, perhaps. We must consider the psychology of the act. Sir Reginald was a man of vigor, of ambition. His announcement at dinner suggested a man with plans, not despair. Hastings nodded, though he felt out of his depth. "What now, Poirot?" "Now we observe," Poirot replied, his voice soft but resolute. "We listen, we question, and we watch. The truth lies in the details, the glance, the gesture, the word left unsaid. Come, let us join the others in the lounge." They left the suite, the door locked behind them by Captain Withers, and made their way to the lounge, where the guests sat in uneasy silence. The room was a study in luxury, plush velvet chairs, a grand piano, and a bar stocked with crystal decanters, but the atmosphere was funerary. Lady Beatrice stared out a window, her face a mask of grief. Clara and Lawrence sat close together, whispering, while Dr. Carver leafed through a medical journal, his expression unreadable. Mrs. Florence Marwood's usual flamboyance was subdued, her crimson shawl now draped loosely over her shoulders. Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, maintained his hawk-like vigilance, his gaze flickering between Poirot and the revolver. Miss Evelyn Grey, the quiet secretary, lingered at the edge of the group, her earlier warning to Hastings echoing in his mind. Poirot clapped his hands, drawing their attention. "Mesdames et messieurs, a terrible crime has occurred, and it is my duty to uncover the truth. I will speak with each of you in turn, beginning now. Lady Beatrice, if you please." Lady Beatrice rose, her movements graceful but strained, and followed Poirot to a small alcove at the far end of the lounge. Hastings watched as Poirot began his questioning, his voice too low to hear, but his posture one of absolute focus. Hastings knew this was only the beginning. Poirot's method was slow, deliberate, and unrelenting. The little gray cells were at work, and no secret would remain hidden for long. As Hastings observed the remaining guests, he noted their subtle interactions, Clara's nervous glance at Lawrence, Marwood's fidgeting with her shawl, Trent's calculated stillness. The sapphire yacht was a floating prison, and within its confines a murderer lurked. Hastings felt a shiver of excitement mingled with dread. Poirot had arrived, and the hunt for the truth had begun.
Chapter 4.
The questions begin. The lounge of the sapphire yacht, bathed in the soft glow of crystal chandeliers, was a stark contrast to the grim events unfolding within its opulent confines. The guests sat in uneasy clusters, their earlier conviviality replaced by a palpable tension that seemed to cling to the velvet upholstery and polished wood. Hercule Poirot, his diminutive figure radiating authority, stood in the alcove where he had just concluded his private conversation with Lady Beatrice Hawthorne. His green eyes, sharp and unyielding, surveyed the room as he prepared to continue his methodical inquiry. Captain Hastings, seated near the bar, watched his friend with a mixture of awe and impatience, knowing that Poirot's interviews would be the first step toward unraveling the mystery of Sir Reginald's death. Poirot adjusted his cuffs, a gesture of fastidious precision, and called out in his clear, accented voice, "Mademoiselle Clara, if you would be so kind." Clara Hawthorne, still pale from the shock of her father's death, glanced at Lawrence Vale, who gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. She rose, her silk dress rustling, and followed Poirot to the alcove, her steps hesitant but resolute. Hastings observed the other guests as Poirot began his questioning. Lady Beatrice, now seated near the grand piano, dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, though her expression was more composed than before. Lawrence Vale leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming lightly on the armrest, his gaze fixed on the alcove. Dr. Edmund Carver continued to leaf through his medical journal, though his eyes flicked upward occasionally, betraying his interest. Mrs. Florence Marwood sipped her brandy, her crimson shawl now draped over the back of her chair, while Mr. Gerald Trent stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid, his face a mask of controlled neutrality. Miss Evelyn Gray, ever the unobtrusive secretary, sat with her notebook, her pen poised, but still, as though she were cataloguing the scene in her mind. In the alcove, Poirot's voice was low, his tone gentle but probing. "Mademoiselle Clara," he began, "your father's death is a great tragedy. I must ask you to recount your movements this evening, from the moment dinner concluded until the scream was heard at 9:47 p.m. Clara's voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "After dinner, Lawrence and I went to the deck. We wanted some air. It was such a warm evening. We were there until we heard the scream. Then we ran to Father's suite with the others." Poirot nodded, his mustache twitching. "And during this time, you were together, toujours. You saw no one else?" "No one," Clara confirmed, her eyes meeting his briefly before dropping to her lap. "Bon. And your father, did he seem troubled to you this evening? His announcement at dinner, it was significant, no?" Clara hesitated, her fingers twisting a pearl bracelet. "He was different. Father was always so confident, but tonight he seemed distracted, almost anxious. That announcement about a decision, it wasn't like him to be so vague." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "And this decision, did he share any details with you, his daughter?" "No," Clara said, shaking her head. "He only said it would affect us all. I thought it might be about the business, or perhaps—" She trailed off, her cheeks flushing. "Perhaps," Poirot prompted, his tone gentle but insistent. Clara glanced toward the lounge where Lawrence sat. "I thought it might be about my engagement to Lawrence.
Father approved, but he was particular about the timing. He wanted everything settled with the business first. Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. Please return to your fiancé." As Clara rejoined Lawrence, Poirot called for Mr. Vale next. The young man strode to the alcove with an air of confidence, though Hastings noted a slight tightening around his eyes. Poirot repeated his questions, and Vale's account aligned with Clara's. They had been on deck together, alone, until the scream. But when Poirot pressed him about Sir Reginald's announcement, Vale's response was more guarded. "Sir Reginald was a man of strong opinions. He didn't share his plans with me, but I gathered he was planning a major change, perhaps selling part of the company. He mentioned something about new directions last week." Poirot's expression remained impassive. "And you, monsieur, as his future son-in-law, had no concerns about this change?" Vale shrugged, a touch too casually. "I trusted Sir Reginald's judgment. He built an empire, after all." The interviews continued, each guest summoned to the alcove in turn. Dr. Carver reiterated his alibi of being in his cabin reviewing notes and described Sir Reginald as a hardy man unlikely to take his own life. The wound was clean, he added, consistent with a deliberate act, whether by his hand or another's. Mrs. Marwood, her theatrical flair returning, recounted her time in the lounge with Lady Beatrice, insisting she had heard nothing unusual until the scream. Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, was curt, confirming he was alone in the smoking room and offering little beyond a vague comment about Sir Reginald's complex financial affairs. Miss Evelyn Grey was the last to be questioned. She sat opposite Poirot, her hands folded neatly, though her knuckles were white. "I was on deck, as I told Captain Hastings," she said softly. "I saw no one until the scream." Poirot tilted his head, studying her. "And your concern about Sir Reginald, mademoiselle, what prompted it? You spoke of his agitation. Did you observe anything specific?" Miss Grey hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the others. "He was short-tempered this afternoon. He received a letter that upset him. I saw him reading it in his study before we boarded. He burned it afterwards, but he was shaken." Poirot's eyebrows rose. "A letter, you say, and its contents?" "I didn't read it," she admitted, "but he muttered something about betrayal as he threw it into the fire." "Betrayal," Poirot repeated, his voice soft. "A word of great weight. Merci, mademoiselle." As Miss Grey returned to her seat, Poirot rejoined Hastings in the lounge, his expression thoughtful. "What do you make of it, Poirot?" Hastings asked quietly. "They all have alibis, but none seem airtight." Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "Alibis, mon ami, are like the waves outside. They appear solid, but shift under scrutiny. Each guest has given me a piece of the puzzle, but it is the contradictions, the hesitations, that intrigue me. The letter Miss Grey mentioned, for instance, why burn it? And why did no one mention the scream's source?" Hastings frowned. "You think it wasn't Sir Reginald who screamed?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I think, Hastings, that we have only begun to peel back the layers of this affair. Tomorrow I will examine the suite again, and we will speak with the crew. For now, let us observe these guests. The murderer is among them, and the little gray cells of Hercule Poirot will not rest until they are found. As the guests dispersed to their cabins, Hastings lingered, watching Poirot's meticulous figure against the backdrop of the darkened sea. The yacht was a gilded cage, its secrets locked within, and Hastings knew that Poirot's questions were only the beginning of a relentless pursuit of truth.
Chapter 5. The Red Herrings. The morning sun cast a pale light over the sapphire yacht, its rays filtering through the heavy curtains of the lounge where the guests had reconvened. The air was thick with unease, the elegance of the previous evening's gathering replaced by a somber tension that clung to every word and glance. Hercule Poirot, immaculate as ever in his tailored suit and polished shoes, stood near the grand piano, his hands clasped behind his back, his green eyes scanning the assembled group with the precision of a watchmaker. Captain Hastings sat nearby, his notebook open, though he found himself scribbling more questions than answers. The death of Sir Reginald Hawthorne hung over the yacht like a storm cloud, and the arrival of the police was still hours away, leaving Poirot as the sole arbiter of truth in this floating prison. The guests, seated in a loose semicircle, wore their exhaustion plainly. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, her face pale but composed, sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Clara Hawthorne, her eyes red-rimmed, leaned against Lawrence Vale, whose easy charm had given way to a strained alertness. Dr. Edmund Carver maintained his scholarly demeanor, though his fingers tapped restlessly on the arm of his chair. Mrs. Florence Marwood, her crimson shawl replaced by a more subdued navy scarf, sipped coffee with a trembling hand, while Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, stood apart, his sharp gaze fixed on Poirot. Miss Evelyn Gray, ever the quiet observer, sat with her notebook, her expression unreadable, but her posture tense. Poirot cleared his throat, drawing all eyes to him. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but commanding, "we find ourselves in a most delicate situation. A man is dead, and the truth of his demise lies hidden among us. Last night I heard your accounts, and now we must dig deeper. The police will come, but until then, Hercule Poirot will uncover the contradictions that betray the guilty." A murmur rippled through the group, and Hastings noted the fleeting glances exchanged. Clara's nervous look at Lawrence, Mrs. Marwood's quick glance at Lady Beatrice, Trent's impassive stare. Poirot's words had stirred the pot, and Hastings knew his friend was watching for the first cracks in the guests' carefully constructed facades. Poirot turned to Captain Withers, who stood by the lounge entrance. "Monsieur le Capitaine, you have questioned the crew, oui? Did any see or hear anything unusual at 9:47 p.m. when the scream was heard?" Withers, his weathered face grim, shook his head. "The crew were at their posts, deckhands on watch, stewards in the galley, engineers below. None reported anything out of the ordinary until the scream. The steward, Jenkins, was near the corridor and heard it clearly, but saw no one enter or leave the owner's suite." Poirot nodded, his mustache twitching. "Bon," he said, though his tone suggested he was far from satisfied. He turned to the group. "Let us consider the revolver, then. A Smith & Wesson, found near Sir Reginald's body. Who among you is familiar with such a weapon?" A heavy silence followed, broken only by Lawrence Vail's hesitant voice. I've handled revolvers before, he said, his tone cautious. I did some shooting at my club in London, but I didn't touch that one. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And you, Monsieur Vail, were on the deck with Mademoiselle Clara at the time of the scream. Yet you are familiar with firearms. Curious, no? His jaw tightened. It's not uncommon for a gentleman to know his way around a pistol. That doesn't mean I killed him. Clara clutched his arm. Lawrence would never do such a thing. He was with me the whole time. Poirot raised a hand, silencing her. Calm yourself, mademoiselle. I accuse no one, yet. But the revolver, it is a clue that points too conveniently in one direction. We must question its purpose. Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. You think it's a red herring, Poirot? A red herring, mon ami, is a distraction, and this revolver is conspicuous. Too conspicuous, perhaps. Let us explore another avenue. He turned to Lady Beatrice. Madame, you mentioned last night that you were in the lounge with Madame Marwood. Did you see anyone pass by, perhaps toward the cabins? Lady Beatrice's eyes flickered, but her voice was steady. No, Mr. Poirot. Florence and I were discussing her travels. The lounge was quiet until we heard the scream. Mrs. Marwood nodded vigorously. Quite right. We were deep in conversation. Italy, you know, such a marvelous place. I didn't notice anyone until everyone rushed to the suite. Poirot's gaze lingered on her, and Hastings caught the faintest hint of skepticism in his friend's expression. And you, Monsieur Trent, Poirot continued, turning to the solicitor, you were in the smoking room, alone. Did you hear anything before the scream? Footsteps, perhaps, or voices? Trent's eyes narrowed slightly. Nothing, Mr. Poirot. The smoking room is at the far end of the corridor. I heard the scream and came at once. Poirot nodded, but his attention shifted to Miss Grey, who sat quietly, her notebook untouched. Mademoiselle Grey, you were on the deck with Captain Hastings. You spoke of a letter that upset Sir Reginald. Did you see anyone else on deck who might have approached the cabins? Miss Grey hesitated, her fingers tightening on her pen. No, I don't think so. It was dark, and I was focused on speaking with Captain Hastings, but I did hear a door close, faintly, just before the scream. I couldn't say which one. Poirot's eyebrows rose. A door, you say? Most interesting. The timing, it is critical. He turned to the group, his voice sharpening. We have a scream at 9:47 p.m., a body discovered minutes later, and a revolver that suggests suicide or murder staged to look like it. Yet the porthole is locked, the crew saw nothing, and all of you claim innocence. Someone, mes amis, is not telling the truth. A gasp escaped Clara, and Lawrence placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Dr. Carver cleared his throat. Mr. Poirot, the evidence points to suicide, the locked room, the revolver. It's the simplest explanation. Poirot's smile was almost pitying. The simplest, oui, but simplicity is often the cloak of deceit. Consider the cigarette case, open, with one cigarette missing. Did Sir Reginald smoke it, or was it taken to create a false impression? And the papers on his desk, financial documents perhaps, or something more personal. Hastings scribbled in his notebook, trying to keep up with Poirot's rapid observations. The mention of the cigarette case nagged him. Why was it open, and why only one cigarette missing? He glanced at the guests, noting Lawrence Vail's defensive posture and Mrs. Marwood's sudden stillness. Could the revolver be a deliberate misdirection, as Poirot suggested? Poirot clapped his hands, breaking the tension. For now, mes amis, I ask you to remain vigilant. Speak to no one outside this group, and report any unusual observations to me or Captain Hastings. The truth, it hides in the shadows, but Hercule Poirot will bring it to light. As the guests dispersed, Hastings approached Poirot, his voice low. You're certain it's murder, aren't you? The revolver, the locked room, it's all too perfect. Poirot's smile was almost pitying. Perfect, mon ami, is precisely the problem. A true suicide is messy, emotional. This scene is staged, like a play with too many props. The revolver, the cigarette case, the scream. They are red herrings, designed to mislead. But the little gray cells, they see through the fog.
Chapter 6. A Clue in Detail. The midday sun hung high above the sapphire yacht, its light glinting off the calm sea and casting sharp shadows across the deck. Inside the lounge, the atmosphere was heavy, the guests' faces etched with a mixture of fatigue and suspicion. Hercule Poirot, ever the picture of composure, stood by a large window, his hands clasped behind his back, his green eyes scanning the room with the precision of a metronome. Captain Hastings sat nearby, his notebook open, his pen poised to capture the subtle details that Poirot seemed to pluck from the air with uncanny ease. The murder of Sir Reginald Hawthorne had transformed the yacht into a crucible of secrets, and Poirot's methodical probing was beginning to stir the embers of truth. The guests, confined to the lounge under Poirot's request, sat in uneasy silence. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, her regal poise fraying at the edges, sipped tea with mechanical precision. Clara Hawthorne, her youthful exuberance dimmed, sat close to Lawrence Vail, whose fingers tapped restlessly on his knee. Dr. Edmund Carver, his scholarly air intact, read a medical journal, though his eyes darted to Poirot frequently. Mrs. Florence Marwood, her flamboyance subdued, toyed with her navy scarf, while Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, leaned against the fireplace, his sharp gaze never wavering. Miss Evelyn Gray, the quiet secretary, sat with her notebook, her pen scratching occasionally, as though documenting her own observations. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "Madame and Monsieur," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority, "we have established the facts of Sir Reginald's death, but facts alone do not reveal the truth. It is in the details, the small, overlooked inconsistencies, that the murderer betrays himself. Today, we examine such a detail." He moved to a small table where he had placed the silver cigarette case recovered from Sir Reginald's suite under Captain Wither's supervision. The case, polished to a mirror-like sheen, lay open, revealing a single empty slot among the neatly arranged cigarettes. Poirot gestured to it with a gloved hand. "This, mes amis, is curious. One cigarette is missing. Why? Did Sir Reginald smoke it in his final moments? Or was it taken to create an illusion?" Hastings leaned forward, intrigued. "You think it's significant, Poirot? It could just be that he smoked one before it happened." "Non, mon ami. Hercule Poirot does not believe in coincidences. The cigarette case was placed prominently on the desk, yet Sir Reginald was not known to smoke heavily. And the revolver, its position, so neat, so deliberate. These are not the actions of a man in despair, but of a scene carefully arranged." He turned to the group, his eyes narrowing. "Let us consider the timeline. The scream was heard at 9:47 p.m. Captain Hastings and Mademoiselle Gray were on deck. Monsieur Vail and Mademoiselle Clara were also on deck. Madame Marwood and Madame Hawthorne were in the lounge. Monsieur Trent was in the smoking room, and Monsieur le Docteur Carver was in his cabin. But Miss Grey heard a door close just before the scream. Which door, I wonder? Miss Grey shifted uncomfortably, her voice soft. I couldn't be sure, Mr. Poirot. It was faint, perhaps from the corridor leading to the cabins. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. And so we have a clue, a sound, a moment, a missing cigarette. Let us explore another detail. He produced a small folded piece of paper retrieved from the suite during his earlier inspection. This fragment, mes amis, is a fragment of a letter found among the ashes in Sir Reginald's fireplace. It is charred, but one word remains legible: debt. A murmur rippled through the group. Lady Beatrice's teacup clattered slightly, and Lawrence Vail's fingers stilled. Mrs. Marwood's eyes widened, while Trent's expression remained impassive. Poirot held up the fragment, its edges blackened. Miss Grey spoke of a letter that upset Sir Reginald. This, I believe, is its remnant. Who among you knew of a debt that troubled him? Silence followed, thick and uneasy. Finally, Mr. Trent spoke. His voice clipped. Sir Reginald's finances were complex, Mr. Poirot. As his solicitor, I can confirm he had substantial investments, but also obligations. A debt is not unusual for a man of his stature. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Obligations, oui, but a debt significant enough to burn a letter. That is not ordinary, monsieur. And you, Madame Hawthorne, did your husband speak of financial troubles? Lady Beatrice's lips tightened. Reginald handled the business affairs. He rarely discussed them with me. If there was a debt, he would not have burdened me with it. Poirot turned to Lawrence Vail. And you, monsieur, as your future son-in-law, were you privy to his financial dealings? His jaw tightened, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He mentioned challenges, but nothing specific. I assumed his announcement at dinner was about restructuring the company, perhaps to address such matters. Poirot's gaze lingered on him, then shifted to Dr. Carver. Monsieur le Docteur, you knew Sir Reginald socially. Did he ever speak of debts or enemies? Carver shook his head, not directly. He was a private man, though he seemed under strain recently. I attributed it to his health. He was not as robust as he appeared. Poirot's smile was faint. Health, debts, decisions, these are threads in our tapestry. But let us return to the cigarette case. He lifted it, turning it in the light. I have learned from Captain Withers that this case belonged to Sir Reginald, a gift from his late father. Yet it is monogrammed with the initials R.H., Reginald Hawthorne. Why, then, is there a faint scratch beneath the monogram as though another initial was once there? Hastings leaned closer, squinting at the case. Sure enough, a faint mark was visible, barely discernible. Good Lord, Poirot, how did you notice that? The eyes of Hercule Poirot, mon ami, miss nothing, Poirot replied, his tone almost playful. This scratch suggests the case was altered, perhaps to conceal its true owner, or to obscure a past. Who among you has seen this case before? Mrs. Marwood spoke up, her voice hesitant. It's Reginald's, of course. I've seen him with it many times. He was particular about it, always kept it polished. Particular, oui, Poirot said. Yet he left it open with one cigarette missing. And this scratch, it is not the mark of a careless man. He set the case down, his movements deliberate. I propose a theory. The cigarette case was placed to draw attention, to suggest a habit or a moment that did not occur. The missing cigarette, the revolver, the locked porthole, these are pieces of a puzzle designed to mislead. Clara's voice broke the silence, trembling with emotion. You're saying someone staged it to look like suicide, but who would do such a thing to father? Poirot's expression softened. That, mademoiselle, is what we must discover. The truth lies in the details. The door that closed, the letter that burned, the cigarette that vanished. Each of you holds a piece of this truth, whether you know it or not. As the guests exchanged wary glances, Hastings scribbled furiously, his mind racing. The cigarette case, the letter fragment, the mysterious door. Each was a thread, but how did they connect? Poirot's focus on the smallest details was unnerving, yet he knew it was precisely this obsession that would unravel the mystery. Poirot clapped his hands again. "For now, mes amis, remire here. I will inspect the suite once more with Captain Hastings. The little grey cells, they demand clarity, and clarity we shall find." As Poirot and Hastings left the lounge, the detective's voice dropped to a murmur. "The cigarette case, Hastings. It is a clue that speaks of intention. Someone wished us to notice it, to assume Sir Reginald's habits. But the scratch, the missing cigarette, they tell a different story. We are close, mon ami, to a truth that someone wishes to hide." Hastings nodded, his heart pounding with anticipation. The sapphire yacht was a labyrinth of secrets, but Poirot's relentless pursuit of detail was lighting the way forward.
Chapter 7. More Lies Surface. The sapphire yacht rocked gently on the calmed sea, its polished decks gleaming under the afternoon sun. But within its luxurious confines, a storm of suspicion brewed. The lounge, once a haven of elegance, now felt like a stage where every guest played a carefully rehearsed role. Hercule Poirot, his small figure radiating quiet authority, stood near the grand piano, his green eyes flickering over the assembled group with the precision of a jeweler inspecting a flawed gem. Captain Hastings sat nearby, his notebook filled with hurried scrawls, his mind grappling with the web of clues Poirot had begun to untangle. The murder of Sir Reginald Hawthorne had cast a shadow over the yacht, and as the hours ticked by, the guests' facades were beginning to crack. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne sat with her hands folded tightly, her composure a brittle mask. Clara Hawthorne clung to Lawrence Vale, her eyes darting nervously, while Vale's usual charm was tempered by a wary alertness. Dr. Edmund Carver, his medical journal now closed, watched Poirot with a guarded expression. Mrs. Florence Marwood, her navy scarf draped loosely, sipped a glass of water, her earlier flamboyance subdued. Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, stood by the fireplace, his sharp gaze unwavering, while Miss Evelyn Gray, the quiet secretary, sat with her notebook, her pen still, as though she were waiting for something to unfold. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound cutting through the tense silence. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice calm but laced with purpose, "we have examined the details, the cigarette case, the letter fragment, the scream at 9:47 p.m., but details alone do not reveal the truth. It is in the human heart, in the secrets you guard, that the murderer hides. Today, we uncover more of these secrets." He paused, his gaze settling on Lawrence Vale. "Monsieur Vale, you spoke of Sir Reginald's business challenges, yet you were vague. Let us be precise. Were you aware of any specific financial difficulties, debts perhaps, that might have driven someone to act?" Vale's jaw tightened, and he glanced at Clara before answering. "I told you, Mr. Poirot, Sir Reginald mentioned challenges, but nothing specific. He was optimistic about his plans, restructuring, expanding. He didn't confide in me about deaths." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And yet, a letter bearing the word debt was burned in his fireplace. Curious, no? Let us turn to another matter." He produced a small, folded timetable of the yacht's schedule provided by Captain Withers. "This document lists the crew's duties. At 9:45 p.m., a steward, Jenkins, was in the corridor near the owner's suite delivering linens. He heard no gunshot, only the scream 2 minutes later. How, I ask, does a revolver fire without notice?" Dr. Carver cleared his throat, his tone measured. "A silencer, perhaps? It would muffle the shot, though not completely." Poirot nodded, but his eyes gleamed with skepticism.
A silencer, oui, is possible. But no such device was found. And the scream, whose was it? Not Sir Reginald's, I think, for the wound suggests instant death. He turned to Lady Beatrice. Madame, you were in the lounge with Madame Marwood. Did you hear anything before the scream? A muffled sound, a voice, perhaps. Lady Beatrice's fingers tightened on her handkerchief. No, Mr. Poirot. It was quiet until that dreadful cry. Florence and I were talking, as I said. Mrs. Marwood nodded, but her voice wavered. Yes, I was discussing my travels. I heard nothing until the scream. It was so sudden, so chilling. Poirot's gaze lingered on her, and Hastings noted a flicker of unease in her eyes. Madame Marwood, Poirot said softly, you are a woman of keen observation, no? Yet you saw no one pass the lounge, no shadow in the corridor. Mrs. Marwood's hand trembled, spilling a drop of water. No, I was focused on Beatrice. I didn't notice anything. Poirot's smile was faint, but knowing. Bon, let us consider another detail. He turned to Monsieur Trent. Monsieur, as Sir Reginald's solicitor, you knew his affairs intimately. The letter fragment with the word debt, did it refer to a specific obligation, perhaps one that threatened someone in this room? Trent's expression remained impassive, but his voice was clipped. Sir Reginald had many financial dealings. Debts were part of his business, but none so dire as to provoke this. I handled his contracts, not his personal disputes. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, a letter was burned. A letter that spoke of betrayal, according to Mademoiselle Gray. Who betrayed Sir Reginald, I wonder? He turned to Miss Gray, who sat rigidly, her notebook untouched. Mademoiselle, you saw Sir Reginald burn this letter. Did you hear anything else? Another word, perhaps? Miss Gray's voice was barely audible. I thought I heard him say ungrateful as he threw it into the fire, but I could be mistaken. Ungrateful, Poirot repeated, his tone heavy with meaning. A word that suggests a personal wound, not merely a financial one. He paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. Let us explore another thread. Monsieur Vale, you and Mademoiselle Clara were on deck at 9:47 p.m. Yet Miss Gray heard a door close just before the scream. The deck is near the corridor to the cabins. Did you see anyone approach that area? Vale hesitated, his fingers drumming again. No, it was dark. Clara and I were, preoccupied. We didn't notice anyone. Clara nodded, her voice trembling. We were talking about our future. Father's announcement. It made me nervous. I didn't see anyone. Poirot's gaze softened, but his questions pressed on. And you, Monsieur le Docteur, in your cabin, did you hear a door, a step, anything unusual? Carver shook his head. Nothing. My cabin is at the far end of the corridor. The scream was the first thing I heard. Poirot stopped pacing, his eyes sweeping the group. We have a scream, a gunshot unheard, a letter burned, and a cigarette case with a missing cigarette. And now a word, ungrateful. These are not random. They point to a motive, a betrayal, a plan. His voice sharpened. Someone in this room knows more than they have said. A lie has surfaced, and Hercule Poirot will uncover it. A sudden sob broke the silence, and all eyes turned to Mrs. Marwood. Her face crumpled, her hands shaking as she set down her glass. I can't bear it, she whispered, her voice breaking. I didn't want to say, but I saw something. After dinner, before Beatrice and I went to the lounge, I saw Sir Reginald arguing with someone in the corridor. It was brief, but heated. Poirot's eyes gleamed. And who, madame, was this someone? Mrs. Marwood's gaze darted to Lawrence Vale, then away. It was Lawrence. They were near the owner's suite, just after we left the dining saloon. I couldn't hear the words, but Sir Reginald was angry. Vale shot to his feet, his face flushed. That's absurd! I didn't argue with him. I was with Clara the whole time after dinner. Clara clutched his arm. It's true, Mr. Poirot. Lawrence was with me. Poirot raised a hand, silencing the outburst. Madame Marwood, you are certain it was Monsieur Vale? Mrs. Marwood nodded, her eyes glistening. I didn't want to cause trouble, but yes, it was him. Poirot turned to Vale, his expression unreadable. Monsieur, you did not mention this argument. Why? Because it didn't happen. She's mistaken, or lying. The room erupted in murmurs, and Hastings scribbled furiously, his mind racing. Mrs. Marwood's revelation was a bombshell, but was it true, or was she deflecting suspicion? Poirot's calm demeanor suggested he was not surprised, and Hastings knew his friend was already sifting through the layers of truth and deception. Enough, Poirot said, his voice cutting through the noise. We have a new piece of the puzzle, but it is not the whole picture. For now, remain here. I will confer with Captain Hastings and inspect the corridor where this alleged argument took place.
Chapter 8. The Emotional Turning Point. The Sapphire yacht, anchored in the serene expanse of the English Channel, seemed to hold its breath as the afternoon waned. The lounge, with its velvet chairs and gleaming chandeliers, was a gilded cage where the guests sat in strained silence, their nerves frayed by the relentless probing of Hercule Poirot. The little Belgian detective stood near the fireplace, his immaculate figure a stark contrast to the emotional tumult around him. His green eyes, sharp and unyielding, surveyed the group with a quiet intensity that seemed to pierce their carefully guarded facades. Captain Hastings, seated at a small table, clutched his notebook, his pen hovering as he sensed the atmosphere shifting. The murder of Sir Reginald Hawthorne had reached a critical juncture, and Poirot's methodical approach was about to crack open a hidden truth. The guests were a study in tension. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, her regal composure crumbling, sat with her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Clara Hawthorne, her face pale, leaned against Lawrence Vale, whose defensive posture betrayed his unease after Mrs. Marwood's accusation. Dr. Edmund Carver, his scholarly air strained, adjusted his glasses, his eyes flicking toward Poirot. Mrs. Florence Marwood, her navy scarf twisted in her hands, avoided Vale's gaze, while Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, stood rigidly, his sharp features set in a mask of detachment. Miss Evelyn Gray, the quiet secretary, sat with her notebook closed, her expression unreadable, but her eyes alert. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp and commanding. Mesdames et messieurs, we have uncovered lies, half-truths, and secrets. The cigarette case, the burned letter, the scream at 9:47 p.m. Each points to a truth that someone in this room seeks to hide. But now we approach the heart of the matter. A motive, a betrayal, a moment of weakness. He turned to Mrs. Marwood, whose revelation about Lawrence Vale's alleged argument with Sir Reginald had stirred the group. Madame Marwood, you spoke of seeing Monsieur Vale arguing with Sir Reginald after dinner. Yet Monsieur Vale denies this. Let us explore this further. What precisely did you see? Mrs. Marwood's hands trembled and she swallowed hard. I saw them in the corridor, near the owner's suite. It was just after we left the dining saloon, around 9:15 p.m. Sir Reginald was red-faced, gesturing angrily. Lawrence was speaking quickly, his voice low. I couldn't hear the words, but it was clear they were at odds.
Vale leapt to his feet, his face flushed. "That's a lie, Mrs. Marwood. I was with Clara on deck after dinner, as I've said. Mrs. Marwood, why would you invent such a story?" Clara's voice broke, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please, Mr. Poirot, Lawrence wouldn't lie to me. He was with me the whole time." Poirot raised his hand, silencing the outburst. "Calm yourselves, mes amis. Madame Marwood, you are certain of the time, 9:15 p.m. Mrs. Marwood nodded, though her confidence seemed to waver. "Yes, or perhaps a little later. It was before Beatrice and I went to the lounge." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he turned to Lady Beatrice. "Madame Hawthorne, you were with Madame Marwood after dinner. Did you see this argument?" Lady Beatrice hesitated, her lips parting slightly before she spoke. I don't recall. Florence and I were talking as we left the dining saloon. I didn't notice anything unusual." Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings recognized as a spark of insight. "Curious, no? A heated argument in a narrow corridor, yet only one of you saw it." I paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us consider another detail. The burned letter, with the words debt and ungrateful. Monsieur Trent, as Sir Reginald's solicitor, you insist his debts were routine. Yet a man does not burn a letter for a routine matter. Did Sir Reginald have a personal grievance, perhaps with someone close?" Trent's expression remained impassive, but his voice was tight. "Sir Reginald had no enemies I knew of. His business dealings were complex, but he was respected. If there was a personal matter, he kept it private." Poirot's gaze shifted to Miss Grey, who sat silently, her hands folded. "Mademoiselle Grey, you heard Sir Reginald mutter 'ungrateful' as he burned the letter. Did you sense who this word referred to?" Miss Grey's eyes flickered with unease. I couldn't say, Mr. Poirot. He was upset, but he didn't name anyone." Poirot nodded, but his attention was drawn to Clara, whose sobs had grown louder. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. "Why is this happening? Father was good to everyone. Who could hate him so much?" Lawrence placed an arm around her, his voice low but fierce. "Clara, darling, we'll get through this. Mr. Poirot, you're upsetting her. Can't you see she's grieving?" Poirot's expression softened, but his voice remained firm. "Grief, Monsieur Vale, is a mirror that reflects truth as well as pain. Mademoiselle Clara, I must ask you to be strong. Did your father ever speak of someone who disappointed him, someone he felt was ungrateful?" Clara's sobs quieted, and she looked up, her eyes glistening. He sometimes said Lawrence was too ambitious, that he pushed too hard for a place in the company, but he respected Lawrence. He wouldn't call him ungrateful." Vale's face darkened, but before he could speak, a sharp cry came from Mrs. Marwood. She stood, her scarf falling to the floor, her face contorted with emotion. "I can't keep silent any more," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "I lied about the argument, not about seeing Lawrence, but about the time. It wasn't after dinner, it was earlier, in the afternoon, around 3 p.m. I saw Lawrence and Sir Reginald in the corridor, arguing about money. I heard Sir Reginald say, 'You'll get nothing if you push me.' I didn't want to say it in front of everyone, but I can't bear the guilt." The room erupted in gasps. Vale's face went pale, and Clara pulled away from him, her eyes wide with shock. "Lawrence, is that true?" she whispered. Vale's hands clenched into fists. "It's not what you think, Clara. Yes, I spoke with him that afternoon, but it wasn't an argument. I asked about my role in the company after our marriage. He was testy, but it was nothing serious. Mrs. Marwood is twisting it." Poirot's eyes gleamed with interest. "Madame Marwood, this is a significant change in your story. Why did you claim it was after dinner?" Mrs. Marwood's voice broke, tears streaming down her face. "I was frightened. I didn't want to accuse Lawrence directly. But after you kept asking about debts and betrayals, I couldn't hold it in. I thought it might matter." Poirot turned to Vale, his tone deceptively mild. "Monsieur Vale, you did not mention this conversation. Why?" Vale's voice was strained. "It was private, and it wasn't relevant. Sir Reginald was in a foul mood, something about a deal gone wrong. I didn't think it mattered." Poirot's smile was faint but sharp. "Everything matters, monsieur. A conversation about money, a burned letter about debt, a word like ungrateful. These are not coincidences. They are threads in a tapestry of motive." Clara's voice broke the silence, raw with pain. "Lawrence, tell me you didn't do this. Tell me you didn't hurt father." Lawrence's eyes softened and he reached for her, but she flinched. "Clara, I swear I loved your father. I would never—" "Enough," Poirot interrupted, his voice cutting through the emotion. "We have uncovered a truth, but it is only partial. For now, mes amis, remain here. Captain Hastings and I will review the evidence further. The little gray cells, they sense the pattern, and soon the full picture will emerge." As the guests sat in stunned silence, Poirot led Hastings to the corridor. "Mon ami, Mrs. Marwood's confession is a crack in the dam. Her lie about the time, it was meant to protect or to accuse. But it has exposed a motive, money, ambition, betrayal. We are close, Hastings, very close." Hastings nodded, his mind reeling. Mrs. Marwood's emotional outburst had shifted the tide, but was Vale the killer, or was another lie waiting to surface? The Sapphire Yacht was a maze of deception, and Poirot was navigating it with relentless precision.
Chapter 9. The Trap. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the deck of the Sapphire Yacht, its golden rays doing little to dispel the chill of suspicion that enveloped the vessel. Within the lounge, the air was thick with tension, the guests' faces etched with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Hercule Poirot, his small frame radiating an almost palpable authority, stood at the center of the room, his green eyes gleaming with the quiet certainty of a man who saw the endgame approaching. Captain Hastings, seated near the bar, gripped his notebook, his heart pounding as he sensed the moment Poirot had been building toward, a moment when the trap would be sprung and the murderer's mask would slip. The guests sat in a strained semicircle, their earlier facades of civility crumbling under the weight of Mrs. Marwood's emotional confession. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, her composure fraying, clutched a lace handkerchief, her eyes darting nervously. Clara Hawthorne sat apart from Lawrence Vale, her trust in him shaken, her face pale with grief and doubt. Vale, his usual confidence replaced by a defensive edge, sat rigidly, his hands clenched. Dr. Edmund Carver, his scholarly demeanor strained, adjusted his glasses, while Mrs. Florence Marwood, her navy scarf twisted tightly, avoided eye contact. Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, stood by the fireplace, his sharp features set in a mask of vigilance. Miss Evelyn Gray, ever unobtrusive, sat with her notebook closed, her gaze fixed on Poirot, as though anticipating his next move. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp and commanding. "Mesdames et messieurs," he said, his voice steady but with a quiet intensity. "We have reached a critical moment. The lies have surfaced, debts, betrayals, arguments, but the truth remains just out of reach. Tonight we will bring it into the light. Hercule Poirot sets a trap, and the guilty will not escape." A murmur rippled through the group, and Hastings noted the subtle shifts in posture, Clara's trembling hands, Vale's tightened jaw, Madame Marwood's sudden stillness. Poirot's words were a spark in a powder keg, and the guests knew it. Poirot paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us review the facts, oui? Sir Reginald Hawthorne was found dead at 9:52 p.m., a gunshot wound to his temple, a revolver at his side. The porthole was locked, the room undisturbed,
yet a scream was heard at 9:47 p.m. A cigarette case, missing one cigarette, sat on his desk, and a burned letter bore the words debt and ungrateful. Madame Marwood has revealed an argument between Monsieur Vale and Sir Reginald, though the time of this argument has shifted. A lie, perhaps, or a half-truth. But there is more. He stopped, his gaze sweeping the room. The scream, mes amis, it is the key. Who screamed, and why? Not Sir Reginald, for the wound suggests instant death. Someone else was in that room or near it at 9:47 p.m., and that someone knows the truth. Lady Beatrice's voice was sharp, breaking the silence. "Mr. Poirot, are you suggesting one of us screamed? That's absurd. We were all accounted for." Poirot's smile was faint but knowing. "Accounted for, we, but not beyond doubt. Let us test this. I propose a reconstruction, a little experiment to jog the memory." He turned to Captain Withers, who stood by the door. "Monsieur le Capitaine, please bring the steward, Jenkins, and have the crew prepare the corridor outside the owner's suite. We will recreate the moments before the scream." Captain Withers nodded and left, and Poirot addressed the group. "Each of you will take your place as you were at 9:47 p.m. Captain Hastings and Mademoiselle Gray, you were on the deck. Monsieur Vale and Mademoiselle Clara, you are also on the deck. Madame Hawthorne and Madame Marwood in the lounge. Monsieur Trent in the smoking room. Monsieur le Docteur Carver in your cabin, further down the corridor. We will move to these places, and I will observe." The guests exchanged uneasy glances, but complied, rising with reluctance. Poirot led them out of the lounge, Hastings at his side, notebook in hand. The corridor was dimly lit, the polished wood gleaming under the electric lamps. The deck above was quiet, the sea calm, but the atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Poirot directed each guest to their stated position, his movements precise, his eyes missing nothing. Hastings and Miss Gray stood on the starboard deck, near the railing where they had been when the scream was heard. Clara and Vale positioned themselves a few yards away, near the bow. Lady Beatrice and Mrs. Marwood returned to the lounge, visible through the open door. Trent retreated to the smoking room, its door ajar, while Dr. Edmund Carver stood at the entrance to his cabin, further down the corridor. Jenkins, the steward, took his place near the owner's suite, holding a stack of linens as he had been that night. Poirot stood in the corridor, his watch in hand. "It is 9:47 p.m. Monsieur Jenkins, you heard the scream. From where did it come?" Jenkins, a nervous young man, pointed to the owner's suite. "From there, sir. It was sharp, like someone was terrified. Then it stopped." Poirot nodded. "And you saw no one enter or leave?" "No, sir. I was just down the corridor, maybe 10 feet away. No one passed me." Poirot turned to the deck. "Captain Hastings, Mademoiselle Gray, you heard the scream. Did you see anyone approach the corridor?" Hastings shook his head. "No, Poirot. It was dark and we were talking." Miss Gray nodded, but her voice was hesitant. "I heard the door close, as I said, but I didn't see anyone." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Bon! Now let us test the sound." He stepped into the owner's suite, leaving the door slightly ajar, and called out, "Monsieur Jenkins, close the door to the suite, then open it again." Jenkins complied, the door clicking shut, then opening with a faint creak. Poirot emerged, his expression thoughtful. "The sound of the door, it is distinct, oui? Mademoiselle Gray, is this the sound you heard?" Miss Gray hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Yes, it was similar, but I can't be sure it was this door." Poirot's gaze shifted to Clara and Vale. "And you, on the deck, heard nothing before the scream?" Clara shook her head, her voice trembling. "Nothing, Mr. Poirot. Just the sea and Lawrence talking." Vale's eyes narrowed. "I've told you we were together. Why are you doing this?" Poirot ignored the outburst, turning to the lounge. "Madame Hawthorne, Madame Marwood, you heard the scream from here. Did you hear a door?" Lady Beatrice shook her head, but Mrs. Marwood's voice faltered. I might have heard something, but I thought it was the crew moving about." Poirot's mustache twitched. "And you, Monsieur Trent, in the smoking room?" Trent's voice was curt. "Nothing. The smoking room is too far." Poirot clapped, drawing all eyes. "Mes amis, the trap is set. The scream, the door, the keys, they point to a plan. And the plan points to the murderer. We are close, very close." As the guests filed back in, Hastings whispered to Poirot, "You're pushing them hard, Poirot. Do you think Vale's the key?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "The key, mon ami, is not one person, but the pattern. The scream, the door, the keys, they point to a plan, and the plan points to the murderer. We are close, very close." Hastings nodded, his pulse racing. The trap had been set, and the Sapphire Yacht's secrets were about to unravel.
Chapter 10. The Reveal. The Sapphire Yacht's lounge was steeped in a heavy silence, the kind that precedes a storm. The evening light filtered through the wide windows, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished floor, but no amount of opulence could dispel the tension that gripped the room. Hercule Poirot stood at the center, his small, immaculate figure radiating an authority that belied his stature. His green eyes, sharp as ever, moved over the assembled guests, each of whom sat in a state of barely concealed dread. Captain Hastings, seated near the bar, clutched his notebook, his heart pounding with the certainty that Poirot was about to unveil the truth behind Sir Reginald Hawthorne's murder. The little gray cells had been at work, and now the moment of revelation had arrived. The guests formed a tense tableau. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, her regal composure a fragile mask, sat with her hands tightly clasped, her eyes fixed on Poirot. Clara Hawthorne, her face pale and tear-streaked, sat apart from Lawrence Vale, whose defensive posture had hardened into defiance. Dr. Edmund Carver, his scholarly air strained, adjusted his glasses nervously. Mrs. Florence Marwood, her navy scarf twisted in her hands, seemed to shrink into her chair, while Mr. Gerald Trent, the solicitor, stood by the fireplace, his sharp features set in a guarded expression. Miss Evelyn Gray, the quiet secretary, sat with her notebook closed, her gaze steady, but her fingers trembling slightly. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp and final. "Mesdames et messieurs," he began, his voice calm but resonant with purpose, "we have reached the end of our journey. The puzzle of Sir Reginald Hawthorne's death is complete, and the truth, it shines like a beacon. Tonight, Hercule Poirot will reveal the murderer." A collective intake of breath filled the room, and Hastings leaned forward, his pen poised. Poirot's reconstructions, his probing questions, and his relentless focus on the smallest details, the cigarette case, the burned letter, the scream, had led to this moment. The trap had been sprung, and now the guilty would be named. Poirot paced slowly, his hands clasped behind his back. "Let us begin with the facts. Sir Reginald was found dead at 9:52 p.m., a gunshot wound to his temple, a Smith & Wesson revolver at his side. The porthole was locked, the crew saw no one, yet a scream was heard at 9:47 p.m.
A silver cigarette case, missing one cigarette, sat on his desk, and a burned letter bore the words debt and ungrateful. We have heard alibis, lies, and half-truths, arguments, betrayals, and motives. But the truth, mes amis, lies in the pattern. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. The scream is our starting point. It was not Sir Reginald's, for the wound suggests instant death. Someone else was in the owner's suite or near it at 9:47 p.m., and that someone holds the key to the crime. He turned to the cigarette case, which lay on a table before him. This case, with its missing cigarette and faint scratch beneath the monogram R.H., is no mere prop. It was placed to suggest Sir Reginald smoked in his final moments, yet he was not a heavy smoker. The scratch, it tells us the case was altered, perhaps to obscure its true owner. But why? He produced the charred letter fragment, holding it aloft. And this letter, burned in haste with the words debt and ungrateful. It speaks of a personal betrayal, not a mere business matter. Who felt ungrateful? Who owed a debt that could not be repaid? Poirot's eyes settled on Lawrence Vale, whose face tightened. Monsieur Vale, you argued with Sir Reginald in the afternoon, not after dinner, as Madame Marwood first claimed. You sought a larger role in his company, oui? But he refused, calling you ambitious, perhaps ungrateful. Vale's voice was sharp. I told you it was a minor disagreement. I didn't kill him. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but she said nothing, her trust in Vale shaken. Poirot raised a hand. Patience, monsieur. Let us consider the timeline. The scream at 9:47 p.m. The body found at 9:52. The steward, Jenkins, was near the suite and heard no gunshot, only the scream. This suggests a silencer, yet none was found. The porthole was locked, the crew saw no one, yet Mademoiselle Gray heard a door close just before the scream. He turned to Miss Gray, whose face paled. Mademoiselle, you have a key to the owner's suite. You heard the door, and you spoke of Sir Reginald's agitation over a letter. You are observant, yet you hold back. Why? Miss Gray's voice trembled. I've told you everything, Mr. Poirot. I didn't use my key that night. Poirot's smile was enigmatic. Perhaps, mademoiselle, but let us test the pattern. He turned to the group. The revolver, it is too convenient. A suicide, they say, yet the screen contradicts this. A murderer staged the scene, placing the revolver to suggest Sir Reginald took his own life, but the cigarette case with the missing cigarette was a mistake. It belonged not to Sir Reginald, but to another, its monogram altered to conceal its true owner. He stopped, his eyes locking on Dr. Carver. Monsieur le Docteur, you confirmed the wound was from close range, consistent with suicide or murder. Yet you're in your cabin, far from the suite. Or were you? Carver's glasses glinted as he adjusted them. I was in my cabin, Mr. Poirot. I heard the scream and came at once. Poirot's eyes narrowed. And yet, monsieur, your cabin is near the owner's suite. A faint sound, a door, a muffled shot, might you have heard it and dismissed it? Carver's voice was steady. I heard nothing until the scream. Poirot turned to Lady Beatrice, whose composure faltered. Madame, you too have a key to the suite. You were in the lounge, yet you saw nothing, heard nothing, except the scream? Is this so? Lady Beatrice nodded, her voice barely audible. Yes, Monsieur Poirot, I was with Florence. Poirot's gaze shifted to Mrs. Marwood, whose hands twisted her scarf. Madame Marwood, your lie about the argument's timing was revealing. You wish to protect someone, or to accuse, but there is more you have not said. Mrs. Marwood's eyes widened, but she remained silent. Poirot clapped his hands, the sound sharp and final. Enough! The truth is clear. The murderer is in this room, and the little grey cells of Hercule Poirot have seen through the deception. He paced once more, his voice rising with conviction. The scream was not from Sir Reginald, but from the murderer's accomplice, a distraction to establish the time of death. The revolver was placed to suggest suicide, but the cigarette case with the missing cigarette was a mistake. It belonged not to Sir Reginald, but to another, its monogram altered to conceal its true owner. He stopped, his eyes locking on Miss Evelyn Grey. Mademoiselle Grey, you are the key. You had access to the suite, you heard the door, and you knew of the letter. But you are not alone. You screamed, did you not, to create the illusion of a crime at 9:47 p.m., while the murder occurred earlier. Miss Grey's face went ashen, and she shook her head. No, Mr. Poirot, I didn't. Poirot raised a hand. You were Sir Reginald's secretary, trusted with his secrets, but you were also his confidant, oui? The letter spoke of a debt, not financial, but emotional. Sir Reginald felt betrayed by you, ungrateful for his trust. You, mademoiselle, were in love with him, were you not? A gasp rippled through the room, and Clara's eyes widened. Miss Grey's hands trembled, and tears welled in her eyes. I cared for him, yes, but I didn't kill him. Poirot's voice softened, but his gaze was unrelenting. You did not fire the shot, mademoiselle, but you aided the one who did. The true murderer is Monsieur Trent. Trent's face hardened, but he remained silent. Poirot continued, his voice a blade. Monsieur Trent, you handled Sir Reginald's affairs. You knew of a debt, a financial one, yes, but also a personal one. Sir Reginald discovered you had embezzled funds, oui? The letter was his warning, his accusation. You could not allow it to stand. Trent's voice was cold. That's preposterous, Poirot. You have no proof. Poirot's smile was triumphant. The cigarette case, monsieur. It was yours, monogrammed GT before you scratched it to resemble RH. You placed it to suggest Sir Reginald's habit, but the scratch betrayed you. You entered the suite earlier, using Mademoiselle Grey's key.
Chapter 11. The Reflection. The lounge of the Sapphire Yacht, bathed in the soft glow of the evening lamps, was a hushed sanctuary after the storm of Poirot's revelation. The air, heavy with the weight of truth, seemed to settle over the guests like a fine mist, their faces reflecting a spectrum of emotions, shock, relief, and lingering sorrow. Hercule Poirot stood by the grand piano, his small, immaculate figure a beacon of calm amidst the aftermath of his dramatic unmasking of Gerald Trent as the murderer and Miss Evelyn Grey as her reluctant accomplice. Captain Hastings, seated at the bar, closed his notebook with a quiet reverence, his heart still racing from the precision with which Poirot had unraveled the mystery. The Sapphire Yacht, once a gilded stage for deception, was now a place of reckoning. The guests sat in stunned silence. Lady Beatrice Hawthorne, her regal composure restored but tinged with a weary grief, stared out the window at the darkening sea. Clara Hawthorne, her face streaked with tears, sat alone, her trust in Lawrence Dale shaken, but her heart heavy with the loss of her father. Lawrence Vale, his earlier defiance softened, reached tentatively for Clara's hand, though she did not yet reciprocate. Dr. Edmund Carver, his scholarly air subdued, adjusted his glasses, his expression one of quiet respect for Poirot's genius. Mrs. Florence Marwood, her navy scarf clutched tightly, seemed diminished, her flamboyance extinguished by the weight of the truth. Gerald Trent had been escorted to a locked cabin by Captain Withers, pending the arrival of the police, while Miss Evelyn Grey, her face pale and tear-stained, sat under the watchful eye of a crew member, her confession still echoing in the room. Poirot, his hands clasped behind his back, surveyed the group with a gaze that was both compassionate and resolute. Mesdames et messieurs, the truth has been revealed, and justice will follow. The murder of Sir Reginald Hawthorne was a crime of greed and betrayal, but it is also a tragedy of the human heart. Hercule Poirot has done his duty, and now I reflect on what we have learned. He paced slowly, his patent leather shoes silent on the polished floor. The little gray cells, they see what others miss, the contradictions, the hesitations, the details that betray. The cigarette case, with its altered monogram, was the first thread. It was not Sir Reginald's, but Monsieur Trent's, a relic of his past he could not erase. The burned letter, with its words of debt and ungrateful, spoke of a personal wound, a betrayal by one he trusted. And the scream, the scream at 9:47 p.m. It was the key, a distraction orchestrated by Mademoiselle Gray to obscure the true time of the crime. Hastings leaned forward, captivated by Poirot's calm dissection. "But Poirot," he ventured, "how did you know it was Trent? The revolver, the locked room, it all pointed to suicide." Poirot's mustache twitched, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Mon ami, the scene was too perfect, too staged. A man who takes his own life does not leave a cigarette case open, a letter burned, a room locked with such precision. The revolver, placed so neatly, was meant to mislead, but the silencer, discarded overboard as the police will confirm, revealed the truth. And Miss Evelyn Gray, her guilt was in her eyes, her hesitation, her scream. She was coerced but her heart betrayed her." Clara's voice, raw with emotion, broke the silence. "Why, Mr. Poirot, why did they do it? Father was kind to Evelyn, to Mr. Trent, why betray him?" Poirot's gaze softened as he turned to her. "Mademoiselle Clara, the human heart is a complex thing. Monsieur Trent was driven by greed. He had embezzled funds, and your father discovered it. The letter was his accusation, his demand for restitution. Trent could not allow it to stand, for it would ruin him. Mademoiselle Gray, she was torn by love and fear. She cared for your father, but Trent manipulated her, threatening her livelihood, her reputation. In her weakness, she became his tool." Miss Gray, her voice barely audible, spoke from her corner. "I'm so sorry, Clara. I never meant for this to happen. I thought I could stop him, but he was too strong." Clara turned away, her shoulders shaking, and Lawrence Vale moved closer, his voice gentle. "Clara, let me help you through this. I swear I had nothing to do with it." Poirot's eyes flickered to Vale, and he nodded slightly. "Monsieur Vale, your ambition raised suspicion, but your heart, it seems, is true. The argument with Sir Reginald was a red herring, exaggerated by Madame Marwood's fear and confusion. She sought to protect, perhaps, but her lie only muddied the waters." Mrs. Marwood's face flushed, and she looked down. "I didn't mean to mislead, Mr. Poirot. I was frightened, confused. I thought Lawrence might be involved." Poirot raised a hand, his tone gentle but firm. "Fear, madame, clouds the judgment, but the truth finds its way. The little gray cells, they see through the fog of emotion, the lies of convenience. This case, it reminds us that greed and love, when twisted, can lead to tragedy." Lady Beatrice spoke, her voice steady but heavy with sorrow. "Mr. Poirot, you have brought us justice, but at what cost? My husband is gone, my daughter's heart is broken. What do we do now?" Poirot's expression was one of quiet compassion. "Madame, justice does not erase pain, but it restores order. Your husband's memory will endure, and Mademoiselle Clara will find her strength. The sapphire yacht will reach shore, and the police will take Monsieur Trent and Mademoiselle Gray. You, mes amis, must carry on with truth as your guide." He turned to Hastings, his voice lowering. "Mon ami, this case, it is a reminder of why Hercule Poirot does what he does. The human soul, it is fragile, yet capable of great darkness. But it is also capable of redemption. We must believe this or all is lost." Hastings nodded, his admiration for Poirot deepening. "You're right, Poirot. It's not just about solving the crime. It's about understanding why it happened." Poirot's smile was faint but warm. "Exactement. And now we must prepare for the police. Captain Withers, please ensure the suite remains secure and that Monsieur Trent and Mademoiselle Gray are guarded until the authorities arrive." Withers nodded, his face grim but resolute. "It's done, Mr. Poirot." Poirot addressed the group one final time. "Mesdames et messieurs, I take my leave of you now. The truth is yours to carry, and I trust you will do so with courage. Hercule Poirot bids you good evening." With a slight bow, he turned and left the lounge, Hastings following. In the quiet corridor, Hastings glanced at his friend. "You did it again, Poirot. You saw what none of us could." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "The little gray cells, mon ami, they never fail. But come, let us take the air on deck. The sea, it has a way of clearing the mind." As they stepped onto the deck, the stars bright above and the sea whispering below, Hastings felt a sense of closure. The Sapphire Yacht's secrets had been laid bare, and Poirot, with his relentless logic and keen insight, had brought light to the darkness. The case was closed, but its lessons would linger, a testament to the power of truth.